Thank you.
Thanks, Joan, and welcome everyone. Thanks for joining us this morning. We'll recall that starting over a decade ago with President Obama's so-called pivot to Asia, the U.S. has worked to create a counterweight to China's increasingly aggressive moves to dominate the Southeast Asian and Indo-Pacific regions. This led, as we know, to the initial establishment of the Quad, an informal alliance between the US, Australia, Japan, and India, and the more recent launch of a security partnership between the US, Australia, and the UK, which is nicknamed AUKUS, which envisions developing nuclear submarine capability for Australia. Today, our speaker, Gordon Flake, will tell us how these initiatives have evolved, what their strategic implications are for the stability of the region, and the possible reactions China may have had or will have in dealing with this new scenario right in their own backyard. Now, as founding CEO of the Perth, USA Asia Center, Gordon has led an expert team of researchers and analysts tasked with building a strategic affairs community in Western Australia with connections throughout the Indo-Pacific region. The center focuses on geopolitical issues, policy development, and efforts to build a strategic affairs community across government, business, and academia. The center is based at the University of Western Australia in Perth and has collaborated over the years with over 30 partners to convene more than 400 events in 7 countries. So welcome. Thanks again for joining us from halfway around the world where it is 10 o'clock at night. And I'm going to pass the baton over to you. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Tyler, and thank you to Chappaqua Library as well as Foreign Policy at Chappaqua. It's a great honor for me to participate from the Antipodes. Literally, Perth is the farthest city on the planet on land away from Chappaqua or New York or Washington, for that matter. If you look for the actual Antipodes, the actual opposite point in the planet, it'd be about 200 kilometers or so off the coast of Western Australia. By now, most of you will have figured out that there's a little bit more Arizona in my accent than there is Australia. I've been here in Perth for about 9 years now in my current position, but I'm originally from Arizona, and I spent 25 years in the foreign policy community in Washington, D.C. before deciding to defect the way I did. But obviously that transition impacted the way I think. There's an old adage that where you stand depends on where you sit. I would change that slightly to say how you perceive the world also depends on where you're sitting. Let me take the topic I've been given, AUKUS, the Quad, and the Indo-Pacific, and invert it. Because in many respects, AUKUS and the Quad are reactions to or strategies for the Indo-Pacific. And so if you really want to understand the Quad, or you really want to understand AUKUS, you have to understand the Indo-Pacific first and foremost. While I was in Washington, this phrase, Indo-Pacific, began gaining currency. It became increasingly popular. And I thought it was a ridiculous academic construct that had no use in foreign policy, because you combine the Indian Ocean with the Pacific Ocean, Indo-Pacific, all of a sudden you're talking 2/3 of the planet. You might as well be global. Why in the world did we need this construct? Those views shifted dramatically, sitting as I do now in Perth, Australia's Indian Ocean capital, in many respects at the fulcrum of the Indo-Pacific, that Indo-Pacific diagonal. So let me just give you a little bit of context to this new turn of phrase and help you understand it more substantively. Obviously, there's a lot of framing that we don't use anymore. We used to call Asia the Orient, right? We still, in the United States, particularly those of you on the East Coast, tend to think about Asia as the Far East, when it may be Far East if you're in London, or Far East when you're in Europe. But if you're sitting on the West Coast, or even in Arizona where I was raised, Asia is by all accounts the West in that regard. And so it's just how you look at the world. When I began my professional career 30 some odd years ago, nobody even used the term Asia Pacific, let alone Indo-Pacific. We talked about East Asia, Northeast Asia, Southeast Asia, South Asia. And Australia was part of this mystical land called Oceania, hanging out there with the islands of New Zealand and the South Pacific, right next to Atlantis somewhere, right? It wasn't until the late 1980s when Australia and New Zealand put forth an Asian Century White Paper, decided that they wanted to take advantage of their geographic location and be integrated up into Asia. And at the same time, the dynamic economies of Japan and Korea, Taiwan, Hong Kong, and Singapore recognized that so many of their markets and potential labor force existed in Southeast Asia that we began to use a new construct, the Asia Pacific. The Asia Pacific was fundamentally about how do you incorporate Australia and New Zealand, and yes, to a lesser degree, the smaller Pacific Island states into Asia. That is the Asia Pacific. And so for 25 years now, Asia Pacific, maybe 30 years now, Asia Pacific has been the favored framing of the region. Beginning in the late 1980s, we had the Asia Pacific Economic Cooperation Initiative, APEC. We had the Pacific Basin Economic Cooperation Council. And everybody began to kind of use that term to understand the region until it became apparent that there were some fundamental limitations of that. One limitation was that generally, when people said Asia Pacific, they did not include India. Even today, India is not a member of APEC or any of the initial Asia Pacific kind of organizations. And two things happened. Number one, India on its own right began to grow economically and to grow an influence in the region. And countries like Japan and Korea and Australia and the United States wanted a way to incorporate India into the Asia Pacific. At its core, at its very core, the Indo-Pacific is including India into the Asia Pacific, hence Indo-Pacific. There are many other constructs, and now that this term has become very popular, success has many fathers. And so, Prime Minister Abe back in 2006, right, had this construct of the confluence of two great oceans, an arc of freedom and prosperity. In 2016, I believe it was, Harry Harris, who was then the commander of the United States Pacific Command, what was called, PACCOM, changed the name of the Pacific Command to the Indo-Pacific Command. And he drove a lot of thinking in Washington, D.C., not surprisingly, from his perch in Hawaii. Australia, for its part, very early on began to use the term. Again, and you can understand that because Australia is a three-ocean nation, right? With a Pacific side, a Southern Ocean or Antarctic Ocean side, and an Indian Ocean side. So as early as 2013, the Australian then Defense Minister, Stephen Smith, was the first government official anywhere in the region to use the term Indo-Pacific in a formal government document, the 2013 Defense White Paper. That was repeated in the 2016 Defense White Paper under his successor. By 2017, then Australian Foreign Minister Julie Bishop used the term Indo-Pacific as the framing document behind a foreign policy white paper, and it's continued ever since. The Japanese, for their part, began to articulate a free and open Indo-Pacific strategy. By 2017, the Trump administration adopted that framing and began to push it very actively at East Asia summit meetings in the region, et cetera. India, of course, liked its inclusion. And so by the time you got to the 2018 Shangri-La Dialogue in Singapore, a major meeting of defense officials, the keynote speaker that year was the Indian Prime Minister Modi, and he used the term Indo-Pacific, I think, 13 times in his speech. Right prior to that meeting, inked an agreement with Indonesia, a bilateral agreement between India and Indonesia, which was called an Indo-Pacific Agreement. And then very quickly after that, most states came on board. Southeast Asia as a whole, there's an ASEAN Indo-Pacific outlook. Over the last several years, even the Europeans The United Kingdom has an Indo-Pacific strategy. Germany has an Indo-Pacific strategy. The Netherlands has an Indo-Pacific strategy. The EU as a whole is working in that direction. France has an Indo-Pacific strategy. So the region has begun to reframe its work. So there's an underlying question as to why, right? Well, as I was saying earlier on, one of the first big developments is the rise of India. So the easy answer why is because there's a desire to incorporate India into everything you do, because India of its own right merits inclusion. We want India in the region. But there's actually a broader reason behind this, and I think Tyler hinted at this in his opening remarks, and that is that over the course of the 2000s and the 2010s, there was growing anxiety within the Asia Pacific about the influence of China. Everybody wanted China to continue to grow. They wanted China's economy to continue to grow. And everybody was pretty much supportive of growing Chinese influence. But as China increasingly began to move in a less and less liberal direction, and as they began to show signs of using their leverage in less collaborative ways in the region, then people began to be concerned about China having too much influence and undermining what Australians would call the rules-based order that was inherent in the Asia Pacific. So obviously, if you're faced with a closed infrastructure and one power is getting more powerful, you've got several strategies. One is that you can contest that power, right? But the United States was not eager to go head-to-head with China, and none of the other partners in the region really wanted to go head-to-head with China either. So one way to deal with that is by increasing the size of the pie, by expanding the region, bringing India and other Indian Ocean states into the Asia Pacific, creating an Indo-Pacific, if you will, does several things. It fundamentally makes the region more complex, but it also dilutes the relative power of individual players. In other words, China is less influential in the Indo-Pacific than it would have been in the Asia Pacific. Similarly, the United States is less influential in the Indo-Pacific than it would have been in the Asia Pacific. It becomes not truly multipolar, but it becomes less bipolar. It becomes less G2-ish, right? And not surprisingly, that is kind of a broad trend that Japan, South Korea, ASEAN, most countries in the region, India, Australia, strongly supported. So we're at the point right now where there really isn't a lot of debate about the construct of the Indo-Pacific. It accurately reflects the world in which we live, a world in which we want India as part of the Asia Pacific. There is still a little bit of resistance to it. South Korea, just by dint of its proximity to China and its desire not to offend the Chinese, was relatively slow to come to the term. But under a new conservative government in South Korea, they've changed quite dramatically in the last 6 months. And China hasn't come on board. You know, as recently as 2017, the Chinese foreign minister said, the Indo-Pacific is just so much sea foam, it'll blow away in the wind, right? They viewed the Indo-Pacific construct, like the free and open Indo-Pacific strategy articulated by Japan, as somehow being anti-Chinese. And, you know, you can't deny that the construct of the Indo-Pacific was in part a reaction to Chinese, but China is in the Indo-Pacific. There's no such thing as an Indo-Pacific without China. So it really can't be anti-Chinese. It's just a strategy designed to relatively diffuse the power in that region. So you won't be surprised to know that Australians today, whether it's our prime minister, our foreign minister, our defense minister, or society more broadly, remain quite enthusiastic advocates of the construct, the framing of the Indo-Pacific. So now understanding that, you need to understand that there are different strategies, right? And one thing that we've had to make clear of all along is that the Quad is not the Indo-Pacific, right? The Quad is a grouping or a collaborative initiative between the United States and India and Japan and Australia. All four countries are in the Indo-Pacific, but the Quad is not the Indo-Pacific. There's a lot of the Indo-Pacific that's not in the Quad, including China, including South Korea, including ASEAN, including Vietnam, et cetera, right? But often people, in a counterproductive way, conflated those two terms. You know, they assumed that the Quad was the Indo-Pacific, and if you supported the Indo-Pacific, that must mean you support the Quad. And I think the Quad has gone a long way to alleviating those concerns. The Quad began back in 2004 as a joint response to the Indian Ocean tsunami, after the Boxing Day tsunami in, I think, 26 of at least here in the region, 26th of December 2004. It eventually evolved into a quadrilateral security dialogue between, again, the United States, Japan, India, and Australia. But it was relatively nascent, relatively low level. And in the late 2000s, so 2008, 2009, 2010, most of the countries, including the United States, including Australia, including India, including Japan, were not eager to poke China in the eye. We're not eager to be seen as being polemical. And so all of them just kind of let the Quad die. Right? Sometimes the Indians blame the Australians, sometimes the Australians blame the Indians or the Japanese, but the truth is that no country was pushing it too much. It really wasn't until 2017, with growing concern about the particular role of China in the security space, that the Quad was resurrected at a senior officials level. And then very quickly over the course of 2018, 2019, was elevated to a foreign ministers level. In October of 2020, there was a foreign ministers meeting of the Quad in Tokyo, just weeks before the 2020 election. And then if you've been keeping track, in March of 2021, President Biden convened a virtual meeting of the Quad. So the prime ministers and presidents of the United States, Japan, India, and Australia met virtually in March of 21, and then again in person in Washington, D.C. for the first ever in-person meeting of the Quad leaders, and then most recently in May in Tokyo for another leaders meeting of the Quad. The interesting thing about these leaders meeting is that they have not been security focused. It is no longer referred to as the quadrilateral security dialogue. Increasingly, it is referred to just as the Quad. And the Quad leaders, every meeting, have put forth a pretty robust agenda for what they call doing good in the region. So pandemic response, climate change, infrastructure, technology, and cybersecurity. In the most recent meeting, an added focus on maritime domain awareness, right? So things that are designed not to be controversial, things that are designed not to make it difficult for countries like Korea or Vietnam or Indonesia or Singapore that are not members of the Quad to support the initiative. Because really at this point, you could call the Quad an anti-China alliance, but the issues that the Quad leaders are working on together, and again, it has been a pretty focused initiative of these four, what we would call like-minded countries collaborating in this space, really haven't been in any way, shape, or form anti-China. But by presenting an open, relatively democratic, very transparent, and positive agenda for the region, there is no question an element of competition, an element of contrasting the activities of the Quad with those of other countries in the region, first and foremost being China. So we can get into some of the specific initiatives, but that is the Quad. Again, not primarily a security alliance, but something that bears every indication of continued growth. Australia has already committed to hosting the next leaders meeting of the Quad in Australia in 2023. And there seems to be every indication that the four countries find great value in working together. And it's not just the leaders level now that you will find regularly at the sidelines of the United Nations, at the sidelines of other international or regional meetings. Very quickly, you'll see the US, Japan, Australia, and India kind of pairing off together to coordinate. I'm now wearing my Australian hat, and I think it's a pretty good deal for Australia. You've got a country of 1.3 billion people in India. You've got a country of 365 million in the US, 110 million in Japan. And somehow Australia, by dint of our geography and our position and our capabilities in the region, is included in that grouping. So we're kind of honored to be there, but a very proactive part of that grouping. Now, let me end up by talking about AUKUS, because AUKUS is another strategy for the Indo-Pacific era, and it's a much more defense and security focused one, whereas the Quad is not. There remains a very heated debate in Washington, in Canberra, in national, foreign policy circles of people who want the Quad to have more teeth. They want the Quad to do foreign policy more directly. More importantly, they want the Quad to be an alliance. They want the Quad to have a security, a defense element to it. I personally am quite pleased with where the Quad is, because if you remember, Japan and the United States are treaty allies. Australia and the United States are treaty allies. We have daily, security interactions, planning, cooperation between the United States and those partners. We also have very active trilateral exercises between Australia and Japan and the United States, as well as coordination, planning, communication, et cetera. India is not a treaty ally. That being said, India increasingly works very closely with the Australian military, with the US military, with the Japanese military. All of us have been participating in these naval exercises called Malabar and in others, but they're not branded as Quad, right? They're just our natural thing. And I tend to think that's probably a good way to go about it. We don't need to use the Quad for defense cooperation, for security cooperation, when we've got so many other venues to carry those out, including, again, I'm getting back to the final point here, AUKUS. Just to give you a little bit of context, I was telling Tyler at the beginning that I've spent now the last 9 years living in Western Australia. And during the bulk of the time I was in Western Australia, I tried to convince the world that we weren't isolated, because there's a long-standing kind of woe is me narrative here in Perth that says that Perth is the most isolated capital city in the world. Because, we're 1,200 kilometers away from the next nearest city in Australia. That would be Adelaide. We're a long ways away from Melbourne or Sydney or Canberra or Brisbane, and those East Coast cities. And so Perth has always felt quite put upon and left to its own devices way out there in the West Coast. And we institutionally at the Perth US Asia Center always tried to turn that on its head and to say, look, that sense of isolation, number one, was never true. Honolulu is far more isolated than Perth ever was. But more importantly, it's only true if you look latitudinally and historically. If you look longitudinally, you look north-south, Perth is in the same time zone as Singapore, Kuala Lumpur, Hong Kong, Manila, and Beijing. And within a 2-hour time zone bandwidth, we have 60% of the world's population. We're not isolated. Sydney and Melbourne and Canberra sitting out there by the Tasman Straits and Antarctica. They're the ones who are really isolated, right? Well, after 8 years of trying to put that view forward, it turns out that Perth really is isolated, and it has been so to our benefit. During the COVID-19 pandemic, you may have all followed Australia's experience nationally. Western Australia was a place apart even from the rest of Australia, because we have so few points of contact. Basically a single commercial airport in our main city, 2 roads that come into the state. Literally within a week of the outbreak of the pandemic, Western Australia closed its borders not only internationally, but with the rest of the country. And so if you wanted to come to Perth from Sydney or Brisbane or Canberra or Melbourne, you had to do 2 weeks of hotel quarantine in a government quarantine facility, even traveling within your own country. And that may seem extreme, and it led to lawsuits and a lot of political ire in the country, but the net result was that Perth ended up having arguably the best COVID response in the world, right? We had, between March of 2020 and March of 2022, when we finally reopened our borders, we had 1 person catch COVID and die in Western Australia. And we had a combined total, I think, of 6 weeks of lockdown whenever there's a small breakout, and probably about 10 weeks of masks over the course of 2.5 years, right? And so by the time the borders finally opened in March of 2022, the state was already 98% double vaxxed, 87% triple vaxxed. And so even though COVID just swept through our community this year, I myself got it by June or May rather. By that point, most people were double and triple vaxxed. And so we never had more than, I think, 10 people in ICU, a couple hundred in hospitals. So it kind of worked for us as a state. Now, I mentioned all that just by telling you that sense of isolation meant, and this is where I'm tying this back into the narrative of AUKUS, that for good things and bad things, I was unable for 2.5 years to travel to visit my aged parents in the US, to visit the countries that I worked on, Korea, Japan, India, Indonesia. We were kind of in a bubble. Everything went virtually. My dear mother passed away in February 2001, mercifully not from COVID, but we were unvaccinated, where there were no flights and the borders were locked. I couldn't go. And as soon as we got double vaxxed, and as soon as the borders opened up, I applied for an exit visa, a permission for me to travel and re-enter on compassionate grounds, because my father, like many who have been married for nearly 60 years, if the dear woman goes first, he was on that same trajectory that actuarial tables will tell you don't last a year. So I immediately applied to go visit him, and was denied until I went back and just played politics and said I had to be in Washington for work, and it was approved like that, including my wife accompanying me for work in Washington. We just happened to stop by Arizona for 3 weeks to spend some glorious and precious times with my father. But this is a long story to tell you that I arrived in Washington, D.C. in September of 2021, the same week that they announced the leaders meeting, or not they announced, that they held the leaders meeting of the Quad, and they announced this AUKUS agreement, a defense technology and cooperation agreement between Australia, the UK, and the United States, AUKUS. I can attest that to, other than a very small handful of people in Washington and a very small handful of people in Canberra and in London, nobody had an idea this was coming whatsoever. It was a shock to everybody, and it kind of electrified the community, and it has continued to do so for the last year. All my friends in Washington assumed that I was back in town holding the AUKUS document while it was signed, but it turns out it was just dumb luck, driven by my desire to see my father. I did not, of course, disabuse them of that implication, because I was probably the first non-governmental Aussie that had been seen in Washington in better part of 2 years. We have now had a year since that historic announcement. most of the media attention has focused on the provision of nuclear submarines. And this is a big deal. Many of you will be familiar with Rickover's Navy. Admiral Rickover, was fastidious to the extreme about the safety protocols on board U.S. nuclear submarines, to the point where his basic view is a mistake anywhere is a mistake everywhere. The reputation of the entire program depended on that. And so the U.S. line for 50 years has been that the U.S. does not share its nuclear submarine technology. Again, we're not talking about weapons, we're talking about propulsion technology with anybody, with the exception of the United Kingdom that it shared it with back in the 1950s, right? And so all of a sudden, despite the fact that allies like South Korea and others have long wanted to work with the United States to develop nuclear submarines and have been told that, no, we can't do that, we'll never do that, in a tremendous shock, including a shock, I think, to many within the US nuclear submarine community, all of a sudden we had this announcement by the prime ministers of Australia and the UK and the US that we were going to work together on this. We can get into details in Q&A if you're interested. It came at the end of a process where Australia had agreed to buy French submarines, diesel powered, not nuclear powered. The process wasn't going forward right now. The required secrecy of the deal meant that the French learned about it after the public did and were very put out by the cancellation of their contract. Many in the region, including Indonesia in particular, heard the announcement and didn't make the distinction between nuclear missiles and nuclear power or propulsion, and immediately got worried about the proliferation of nuclear weapons in the region and what Australia might be doing floating around submarines in the region with nuclear weapons. But over the course of the last year, it's increasingly clear that what this really is a plan by which the US and Australia and the UK will cooperate to build new submarines for Australia for the future that will be likely a US designed Virginia-class submarine, or potentially a UK designed submarine that will be built for Australia with nuclear propulsion. And there's a lot of cooperation that's going to be necessary to make that happen. There's a lot of education, of manpower, of the handling of nuclear materials, equipment, training center that has to be done before Australia will meet the standards of again, what we would call Rickover's Navy in terms of that process. There was initially some real reticence in the US Navy and in public policy circles, but by and large right now, this is an emblem of close cooperation between three very important allies on an important issue. The Australians obviously prioritize the relationship with the United States above all else. I tend to be a little bit sympathetic to that view that the Brits are a little bit lucky to be included. This is a way of ensuring them continuing relevance. And obviously we, as in Australia, likes them in the region as well. There is a second element, and I'll end with this because I've already gone a little bit too long, to the AUKUS agreement, which does not get nearly enough attention because the subs are sexy. The second element of AUKUS is technology sharing and joint technology development. Many of you may be familiar with the Five Eyes, the intelligence sharing agreement between not just Australia, the UK, and the US, but also New Zealand and Canada. When I spent 25 years in Washington working primarily on Korea and Japan, I understood that the Five Eyes relationship was different, but I thought it was primarily language and culture. Now, language and culture are important, but there's something even more fundamental, and that's law. The legal infrastructure underpinning the joint collection and sharing of intelligence means that the Five Eyes relationships, and in particular that between Australia and the US, is by orders of magnitude more intimate than any other alliance in the world because they finish each other's sentences. Everyone knows pretty much what the other one knows, right? Taking that relationship a step further to working together on a full range of future technologies is kind of, and future defense industries and supply chains and critical materials in a whole range of areas, is that second pillar of AUKUS. It doesn't get the media attention. I've often said that if the submarines had not been included in AUKUS, it would not have gotten any media attention at all. It wouldn't have been worthy of a press release, right? Because it's just what these three allies do and increasingly have been doing for a while. But in the long run, that technology sharing, joint technology development, intimacy of relationship is designed to make sure that all three partners are stronger together. And that's it in a nutshell. That's the US's, a major component of the US's Indo-Pacific strategy, in addition to its treaty alliances with other partners in the region. So look, I've already gone on for a little bit too long, but I hope I've given you a little bit of context for the Indo-Pacific as a region and for some of the strategies for the Indo-Pacific. And I look forward to a conversation, answering questions that you might have, or going into further depth. And I do apologize for my voice. We're coming out of winter here, and you can tell I've got a bit of a cold.
Gordon, we didn't think you had winter down in Perth. You just, you have to admit it, huh?
It's a weak winter, a little bit cloudy, but
okay.
Body has become soft over the years.
Okay.
Go ahead.
Let me ask the first question, if I could. Clearly, the AUKUS agreement raised eyebrows and even more in Beijing. Would you assess the response from Beijing and how it's evolving? It's a year since it was initially announced. How is it going with that issue?
Yeah, so obviously AUKUS has raised the ire of Beijing. They openly despise it because they see it as an anti-China agreement, and it is. In contrast to the Quad, and in contrast to the Indo-Pacific, which are more regional, AUKUS really is a collective response to growing concerns about Chinese military strength, but more importantly, what is perceived, at least in DC and London and Canberra, as malign Chinese influence in the region. So given that, and given the fact that there's not a lot of other regional parties that have drawn the level of concern in the US, the UK, or Australia the same way that China has, China rightly recognizes this as an effort to respond to their strength, and they don't like it. Over the last year, to be honest, look, I'm one who thinks how quickly a year passes. We still don't have a decision on the submarine as to whether it'll be a British preferred boat in Astute class or the Virginia class. That announcement, I think, will come early next year. I understand that AUKUS coordination, in big, unwieldy defense bureaucracies in the US and the UK and Australia is difficult. And we're told that they have made historic, transitions over the last year. Yeah, I can grant that, but a year has gone by. And so I don't know that we're necessarily moving as fast as we need to be. We're also quickly running up into some really difficult and thorny issues. There are ITAR issues. The process now by which the United States allows the sharing of and export of certain technologies to certain countries, right? And Australia already is in the top tier of the most trusted countries in the world. And so most people in the US State Department will say, well, Australia, you're already our most trusted partner. The problem is, if you want to do something as complex as build a submarine, there are literally tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of individual components that are going to be required for the building of that submarine, plus all the other technology you're working on. And if each individual component requires 2 or 3 months to adjudicate through a State Department ITAR process, right? So it can be exported or shared. You can imagine this project cannot help but fail, right? It will fail. It'll be just dragged out. It'll be killed by bureaucracy. And so one of the early challenges they're doing is, how do we build a new AUKUS category where, rather than everything having to be taken out as an exception individually, everything is approved with some exceptions withheld, right? So that just gives you an indication of how complex and how detailed the challenges are. So AUKUS has made progress. There's been a broad shift in both public and in bureaucratic and institutional support for the agreement in Australia, in the UK, and the US. But obviously, the current pace is not sufficient to the needs. Obviously is evidenced by what's happening in Ukraine, what potentially could happen in Taiwan, cross-straits issues. For AUKUS to be relevant, it can't continue on the pace that it's continued thus far.
Well, the Chinese must be delighted at the bureaucratic delays in store for us, right?
No, absolutely. No question.
They'd probably get it done in 2 or 3 years, and it may take us 10. Well, we'll see. We'll see. Yeah.
Okay. Do you have another question?
Back to the,
Okay. I just want you to know there's one person waiting to ask a question. We'll wait until after you're finished, okay?
Okay. I just got looking back at the Quad. Now, you mentioned that for public consumption, the security elements of the Quad have been kind of downplayed recently in favor of all the good the Quad can do in the region, with development and climate change and so forth. But can we assume that behind the scenes, there has been a lot of talk about prospective security agreements and deals between the 4 countries in terms of looking at a potential hotspot like Taiwan? Or am I dreaming about that? I mean,
no, I don't think so. Again, the Quad leaders meetings have been very open, very transparent. I mean, obviously there will be private conversation, but they've had very detailed readouts and joint communiques that come out of every meeting. So I do not view the Quad leaders meeting as a facade behind which they're having a secret 4-party talk about Taiwan contingencies. Number one is because India is in this, right? And getting India across the line on that would be really hard. That's not something India would be willing to do. India is very comfortable with the Quad agenda as it is, but you remember, India is a country apart on many issues. They've just been slowly coming around to criticism of Russia on Ukraine. And it is true that those kind of conversations take place, but they take place on a bilateral or trilateral level regularly. So again, the US and Japan as treaty allies talk all the time about South China Seas, about Taiwan contingencies, about a whole range of security contingencies, or treaty allies. Same with the US and Australia, and the 3 of those do that trilaterally. Today and yesterday, the Indian Foreign Minister, S. Jaishankar, was here in Australia. He had remarkably forward-leaning conversations with our foreign minister and with our defense minister, gave a number of public speeches. Our foreign minister this morning made a quip that since the Australian government came into office in May of this year, she and Minister Jaishankar have already met 7 times. I think this was actually the 8th meeting that they've had. So yeah, those meetings are happening. They're regular. I just don't, at least to the best of my knowledge and understanding, they're not happening on the Quad level. And that may happen at some point, but that thus far is not how the leaders have chosen to define the Quad or to utilize the Quad.
So in your view then, just to project the question a little longer, if China were to take aggressive action against Taiwan, there would not be an orchestrated response from the Quad necessarily. I mean,
yeah, no. If China were to take action, in fact, there wouldn't even necessarily be an orchestrated trilateral coordination response between Japan and Australia and the United States. There would be a US response. Obviously, another treaty ally, Korea, another treaty ally, Philippines, another treaty ally, Thailand, even less so. They would all have individual responses, but it certainly would not be a regional response. And I don't see it as being a quad response, right? If you note, it's quite interesting. The US still continues to use the UN Security Council. They continue to use the G7 to condemn everything from North Korean missile tests to Russian actions in Ukraine. They haven't used the Quad as a bully pulpit for condemning bad actors. They made the decision to use the Quad as a force for good, right? For coordinating their activities in the region. So again, obviously things can change, things can develop. If the need develops for the Quad to take collective action on security, obviously the muscle memory, the relationships, the coordination that has been taking place over the last 2 years would certainly bring us a lot closer to future coordination. But that's not where I see the current intent or even where I see the current trajectory going. There are other venues for that.
Okay, we do have a question from the audience, but I can't quite understand it. So, Ms. Chang, could you kind of rephrase your question and clarify what you mean by the different letters you put into the question? Then we can get back to that question when you do that.
Okay.
So let me go back to Gordon, if I can. In terms of looking at the members of the Quad, now Japan is, we want to use the phrase turning more militaristic, but obviously in the last few years, they've opened the gates to becoming more of a military presence in the Pacific. Is there any chance that could change? In other words, under Kishida, it sounded like it was happening, but suddenly his popularity ratings in this recent issue with the Abe funeral, oddly enough, plummeted. Now, I don't know if that means he's going to be derailed or kicked out, but I'm just wondering how firm you think Japan's commitment, from what you can see, is to increasing their military spending in a meaningful way.
Well, look, Japan's military spending still does not exceed 1% of GDP. Whereas Australia is well over 2%. Japan has begun to take its own national security much more seriously. Its leadership is very wide-eyed about what they perceive to be the threat from China. And the Chinese have been rather overt about the threat they themselves think they pose to Japan. And so in many respects, it's true that, after a period of time politically where the United States was kicking own goals one after the other, the United States could have lost so much in this region and globally if it had not been for a China that was arguably worse during that same period of time, right? And it has been Chinese overreach in the heights between India and China, in Doklam, in Ladakh, that has kind of fundamentally changed India's willingness to engage, not just with the United States, but on security issues more globally. It's fundamentally changed Japan's approach on so many issues. And those issues are not the controversial issues in Japan, and they're not even the hotly debated issue in Japan. Those issues are the problems that Kishida is having right now with his popularity really have to do a lot more with domestic politics in Japan, deep discomfort in Japan about the role of religion in politics, in particular, obviously in this case, the Unification Church, Reverend Munsan Myung's church, and the political fundraising part of Japan. And that's why there's real discomfort in politics. It really is not, that I've seen anywhere, an indictment of or an expression of concern for Japan's activities in the Quad or vis-a-vis China. In fact, if anything, there's not a lot of political space on that issue in Japan today.
Yeah. And to that point of China seeming to be really kind of unnecessarily provocative, for example, I guess they were fooling around up in the Senkaku Islands a while ago, and that infuriated Japan and got them to be, or led them to be even more anti-Chinese than they were prior to that. And you wonder why the Chinese bother to irritate Japan or amongst other countries by making so-called incursions in islands which are really pretty meaningless in the whole scheme of things.
Yeah, well, look, I mean, there's an entirely different lecture in terms of why China is doing what China is doing. And we're having this conversation now days away from the party Congress in China that will almost certainly enshrine Xi Jinping in for an unprecedented third term as kind of emperor, God, king for life, right? There is a lot of evidence to suggest that Chinese have overreached, that a combination of their domestic problems has led them to kind of push externally. But, it's pretty much a miscalculation. I mean, you're hard pressed. It's easy to blame this on a particular American president or an American action. But, you find me a country in the world today who doesn't have either a problem with or deep-seated concerns about China. And even the countries like Laos and Cambodia that are bought and paid for, that is their politicians, right? The people themselves are deeply concerned. There's strong resistance to that, right? So, why does China continue to take actions that are demonstrably not in their own interest? Well, because the Chinese system now is geared towards the approval of one man. And so Chinese diplomats, these so-called wolf warrior diplomats, are making statements and taking actions that are designed for an audience of one. They're not designed to improve understanding and relationships with Europe or Australia or the United States. They're designed to show the leader in Beijing how strong they can be supportive of that, right? And so, we're a long ways away from the Deng Xiaoping era of hide and bide, hide your strength and bide your time, right? They beginning 2008, after the financial crisis in the United States, kind of thought the US was a spent force. This was their time, and they're very, very progressive on that. Now, look, there's a number of questions. I can see them right in front of me. Do you want me just to address some of those directly and call them out? Would that be helpful?
Yes, that would be very helpful. The first one.
We just have a very short time left, so I'll go through these quite quickly. Merla Morrison asks, where does New Zealand fit into these relationships? Look, New Zealand is the Canada of Australia, right? And I say that as someone whose mother was Canadian, right? It's right next door, heavily influenced by, doesn't have a fundamentally different approach on many of these issues, has been a little bit slower on China because it's further away from that, and it can rely upon its next door neighbor, Australia, for its larger protection. So New Zealand has had a more cautious approach than Australia, has been less direct on these. It's also had a more progressive government compared to a more conservative government in Australia. But even that in Australia has kind of undergone. So New Zealand, again, I would also add a caveat that I'm in Perth, Western Australia, and I realize that you all think that we're right next door to New Zealand, we hop over, but I'm actually closer in Perth to Hong Kong than I am to Auckland. So I won't put myself forth as a great New Zealand specialist. Chang Yifei has come back asking about the evolution of the construct. Look, the question is, who drove the Quad? I don't think it was driven by the United States. I think it was driven by countries like Australia, like India, and like Japan. And so I think Yifei has been very accurate. The Quad was driven primarily by Japan and Australia and India, and the US has supported it. The US didn't wake up one morning and said that we wanted to be active. And that's certainly true of the Indo-Pacific as a construct, right? Or that's true of the Indo-Pacific. The Quad, on the other hand, excuse me, if I'm a little bit more accurate on that, is something that the US supported very early on. And it is only palatable by the participation of the others, right? So again, let me just clarify real quickly. the Indo-Pacific as a construct was driven by Japan and Australia and India, primarily in the US, came to that understanding. The Quad, obviously by its nature, is driven by all four, right? Any one country doesn't get into it, then it's not a Quad, right? So really all of them had to be, the US had more of a leadership role in the Quad, more of a desire to convene from the very beginning than I think probably any other, but clearly Japan and Australia also welcomed it, and it's India's willingness that made it. No India, no Quad, no India, no Indo-Pacific. And I agree with you, Ife. Obviously, Australia is eager to participate. I'm not so sure the AUKUS, US-Australia defense cooperation is not driven by the UK. AUKUS as a format is. It is UK's decision to be included. And finally, the last one, just so I don't ignore them, a good question from Alan Christenfeld, indicating that that there are parallels in the recent past in terms of policies of containment we had towards the Soviet Union, expressing skepticism towards AUKUS in terms of that process. I actually don't view this as a question of containing China. Alan asked what my view is on the likelihood of containing China. Look, no one's trying to contain it. We all wanted and supported China's growth, right? What we're trying to do is protect what we in Australia call the rules-based order, right? So we continue to want Chinese economic development. We continue to want better, freer, more prosperous lives for the Chinese people, but we don't want the rules-based order, the liberal international system, to be undermined by Chinese actions, which are designed not by Chinese national interest, not by the interests of the Chinese people, but by the interests of leaders of the Chinese Communist Party for their short-term political gains. And I'm a little bit more optimistic about those prospects. So anyway, I realize very short answers to complex questions, but I think I've clicked through those that are in front of me in the time that I've been allotted. So,
Gordon, let me hit you with one more question before we let you go, if that's okay. South
Sure.
Korea obviously would be a significant addition to the Quad. They've been hesitant for obvious reasons. I think you've mentioned them. Under President Yoon, do you think that will gradually change for a more positive view of joining the Quad?
It hasn't gradually changed, it's dramatically changed. The previous president in South Korea, President Moon Jae-in, had made his centerpiece and his only real foreign policy priority was the reconciliation with North Korea. It's a longer conversation about the merits of that approach. But what that meant was every issue for him and his government was viewed through the prism of how that might impact North Korea, how that might impact their ability to get Chinese cooperation or Russian cooperation on North Korea, et cetera. And it really meant that Korea, despite being a treaty ally in the United States, was not in the Trans-Pacific Partnership, the trade agreement. It was not even considered early on for the Quad. They self-opted out. Today, Korea under President Yoon Suk-yeol is much more proactive about using the term Indo-Pacific, wanting to collaborate with the Quad, wanting to collaborate with AUKUS, wanting to work together with India and Australia and Japan even, where there's historical legacy issues. And so it's really been a dramatic transformation as Korea has once again become a very active international player. I don't think that means that they will join the Quad in the near future. I mean, obviously, by definition, they can't join the Quad because if they do, it becomes a Quint, not a Quad. But I think at this point, there's a big enough agenda. I think there's going to be a lot of discussion about Quad Plus or collaboration with the Quad or AUKUS Plus. I don't think anybody's looking to it. The one thing to watch is Korea has hinted that along with the UK, they want to join the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, CPTPP. And that's one early, very important step, obviously, which the United States still remains tied up in knots over that hasn't done. So hopefully that gives some sense.
Yeah. Well, Gordon, I think we've asked the key questions. Hopefully we've resolved some universal issues in the world, and maybe we haven't, but what the heck, it was a good try. So thank you very much. Appreciate your time. And it's been illuminating on some very key issues in the Indo-Pacific, if we can roughly use that term still, after all your comments about it.
Well, beautifully used. I appreciate it. And it's a great honor. I really appreciate the chance to speak to your organization, and I applaud your tremendous programs and the reach that you have with those programs. So happy to join you from the farthest point on the planet on land away from Chappaqua.
Okay. Thank you again. Thank you, Tyler.
Thanks again, Gordon. Yep.
And again, Gordon Flake, thank you very much. We appreciate your input. So I hope everybody here had an informative and good time, and I hope to see you at the programs at the Chappaqua Library. Goodbye.
Okay,
Bye,
thanks,
everyone.
Joan.